Hello and welcome to the History of the Germans, episode 162, Schisms and Deals, the international policies of Emperor Karl IV, which is also episode 25 of season 8, From the Interregnum to the Golden Bull. For more than 100 years, the Holy Roman Empire was a mess of constant infighting between and then within the great princely families. But by the 1360s, the consistent policies and elaborate diplomacy of Emperor Karl IV had produced a degree of stability not seen by anyone alive. With the home front calm, the emperor can again assume a role on the imperial stage, setting in train seminal events that will reverberate across the centuries. But before we start, it is once more time for me to come before you like an Avignon Pope in search of an armed escort to Rome. You know that keeping this show on the road is already a whole lot of work as it is, and now that we move into the early modern period, the research effort required is growing exponentially, which is why I'm contemplating adding some support to the team. And that will come at a cost that is borne by our generous patrons who've signed up on my website historyofthegermans.com/support, where you can make a one-time contribution or subscribe on Patreon. Please remember that if you own an iPhone, do not sign up on Patreon from this phone, since Apple will charge you a whopping 30% for absolutely nothing. And thanks a lot to Richard J., Günther R., the fan of Simplicissimus, Madeleine S., Stefan K., Tom J., and Patrick A., who've already taken the plunge. Now back to the show. These last two episodes we have focused on domestic policy, specifically the Golden Bull and how it shifted the political structure of the empire without saying anything fundamentally new. Now it is time to look at Karl IV's role in a European context. And the first point to make is that there was a role in the European context at all. For the last 100 years, the kings and emperors had been preoccupied holding on to the bucking bronco that was the Holy Roman Empire. When they ventured abroad, it was to get to Rome to be crowned and ideally coming back without succumbing to disease, excommunication or attempted murder. Karl's clever policies and generous offers of marriages and military support, neither of which ever arrived, kept his enemies divided and the empire free of major civil wars. And so, he was the first ruler since Frederick II to cast his eye beyond the borders of the empire. And cast afar he does. In 1370, he develops an interest in the Hanse and in Denmark. Yes, all the way north. No emperor had given a thought to these far-flung places for centuries. Yes, Frederick Barbarossa had been in Lübeck in 1181 as part of the campaign to topple Henry the Lion. But that was an exception to the rule. Since Henry IV, the emperors had stayed well clear of Saxony, well, unless they were Saxons themselves, like Lothar III and Otto IV. And if you've listened to the series about the Hanseatic League, the year 1370 is the year when the Hanse in general, and Lübeck in particular, reached the absolute pinnacle of political, if not economic reach. They have just defeated King Valdemar Atterdag, the Morning Dawn who had reconsolidated the Danish kingdom. And as a consequence of that victory, the Hanse had gained a de facto monopoly on Baltic trade. Namely the trade in the furs and beeswax from Novgorod, the grain from all along the Baltic coast and Poland, the metals from Sweden, and most importantly, the herring from Denmark, the staple food during the over 200 fast days Catholic Europe observed at the time. Now, one indicator how important the imperial court had already become was that Valdemar Atterdag fled Denmark after his defeat and came to Prague. He lobbied the emperor to punish the Hanse cities for daring to attack an anointed monarch. But Karl had no intention to go after Lübeck. The city and its Hanse associates featured highly in his plans to foster the economy of his own lands. One of his many projects was to divert the trade from the traditional north-south route along the Rhine to a new route, from Venice via Vienna, Prague and Brandenburg to the Baltic and the North Sea. Now, Karl did not only refuse to help King Valdemar of Denmark, he actively supported Lübeck. He appointed the Bürgermeisters of Lübeck as his imperial vicars, making them the most senior representatives of the empire in the north. And this is the very first time that such a role was granted to anyone who wasn't a senior aristocrat. And on the 20th of October 1375, he showed up in person. For a full 11 days, the city of Lübeck celebrated an imperial visit, a celebration that wrecked the city's already fragile public finances. And in return, the emperor addressed the members of the councils as Herren or lords, which must have made it all worth it. And then Karl did the other thing he was so great at, keeping people guessing. Because once the emperor was wined and dined by the great merchants of the Hanse, King Waldemar Atterdag had finally passed away without a male heir. The result was a war of succession between the Duke of Mecklenburg and Waldemar's daughter, Margaret. The Hanse very much supported Margaret, as they did not want to be surrounded on all sides by a ruler who ran both Denmark and Mecklenburg. Karl nevertheless let slip that he preferred a Mecklenburg succession. Did he really? Or was it just another bargaining chip in his constant, complex game of give and take? My guess, it was the latter. Now, whilst Lübeck was the northernmost end of his travels, he also journeyed south again, and this time on a pan-European mission. The reason for this journey lay in Avignon. By 1365, the popes had resided outside of Italy for 60 years already. The reigning pope, Urban V, was the sixth pontiff to stay in Avignon. They had made themselves comfortable in the ever more splendid papal palace. They had bought the Comté Vanassin, the county surrounding Avignon, from the House of Anjou, and then Karl had released them from the imperial overlordship. But still, the popes chafed under the influence of the French kings. Ever so often, the popes had to make decisions in the interest of the House of Valois they would not have otherwise made. And this bias was making the church lose ever more prestige amongst the other monarchs across Europe. Feeling the pinch, the successors to St. Peter had been looking for ways to get out of the clutches of the French. And there was one obvious way to do that, and that was returning to Italy. And, if possible, returning to Rome. Now, the popes had tried to lay some groundworks by sending the energetic Cardinal Albornoz to rebuild papal influence in Rome. By the way, this Albornoz was the cardinal who had accompanied Cola di Rienzi and had then helped topple him. But despite hiring mercenary armies and fighting his way across what used to be the Papal States, Albornoz's resources were simply insufficient to secure a safe return for the Pope to Rome. Now, given that none of the Italian republics and autocracies wanted the Pope back, the only power in Europe that could secure a return of the pontiff was the emperor. So, when Karl came to Avignon in 1365 to discuss various other subjects to do with the plague of unemployed soldiers rampaging across the countryside, Pope Urban V steered the conversation forcefully towards a second journey to Rome. Now, we do not know whether Karl embraced the idea joyfully out of his profound piety, or whether he believed it to be a massive waste of time and money. But he could not refuse Urban's demand. As emperor, he was the protector of the church, and Christians all across Europe longed for the Pope to return to Rome. One famous propaganda image of the time shows Saint Bridget of Sweden cowering amongst the ruins of a desolate Rome, praying for the return of the Pope. Urban V set off for Italy in 1367 and miraculously made it to Viterbo in one piece. But then he ran out of puff. There was no way he could get into the Holy City by hook or by crook. So the Pope demands Karl's help most urgently. Karl had been delayed by another outbreak of the Black Death, the reluctance of princes and cities to provide money and soldiers, and the usual complexity of Italian politics. Finally, in April 1368, he did set off with a sizable army, mostly again comprising of mercenaries. He entered Italy from the northeast via Friuli and Aquileia and made his way to Milan. Barnabo Visconti, the ruler of Milan, is not only a long-standing opponent of the emperor, but also reluctant to let the Pope get back into the Papal States. So as usual, there's a bit of moderate fighting before Karl got everybody to sit down around a table and hammered out a deal. The Visconti agreed to let the imperial army pass, provided 1,000 additional helmets, in exchange for being made imperial vicars of Lombardy. Next up is Tuscany, where Karl gains free passage by approving whichever party had just recently seized power in whichever bloody coup and was now in need of some legitimacy. October 1368, Karl IV entered Rome, and on the 29th of this month he welcomed Pope Urban V at the gates of the city. Honoring an entirely made-up ancient tradition, Karl dismounts his charger and leads the papal horse with the Pope on top to the Lateran Palace. This service of the groom had been a point of contention for popes and emperors since, well, forever. Some observers, like for instance the great Nuremberg banker Ullmann Stromer, described this act as a humiliation for the Reich. But others, like the Italian humanist Colucci Salutati, sees it as an image of hope. The two leaders of Christendom acting in unison, returning the Church to its natural home. It is that latter image that finds most currency across Europe. And it is backed up with further displays of unity. Pope and Emperor spent the next 2 months in close proximity, discussing how Italy in general and the Papal States in particular could be stabilized. Tuscany was a particularly complicated part of the conundrum. They tried to instigate a coup in Siena, but that failed. The next focal point was then Lucca. Lucca had fallen under Pisan control, something the Lucchese found unbearable. So in spring 1369, Karl took his army to Lucca and declared it a free and imperial city, thereby cancelling the Pisan overlordship. The Pisans could not do much about that, in part because of Karl's army and in part because they were caught up in brutal infighting between the elites and the middle classes. Lucca still commemorates this day with a great parade on every Sunday after Easter, the day the city threw off the Pisan yoke. So, all the good stuff. But now summer is approaching, and with it the risk of disease goes up stratospherically. Karl took his army and returned across the Alps. So much for everlasting unity between Pope and Emperor. Poor Pope Urban V realized quite quickly that there was no way he can hold out in Rome all by himself. So he packed his bags and returned to Avignon, no doubt cursing the inconsistency of the emperor. Urban V died a few months later, passing the baton on to Gregory XI. Now, the old pope may be gone, but the fundamental problem has not gone. The popes still needed to go back to Rome. After Urban V's debacle, his successor Gregory XI did not rely on the emperor to pave the way to Rome. Instead of oaths and loyalty, Gregory XI and his legate, Robert of Geneva, believed in the power of money. The Pope hired even more mercenaries, including the famous company of John Harwood, who forged a way to Rome with fire and sword. It was a hard fight, since almost all North Italian cities had by now joined a league intended to stop the Pope from returning. But return he did. He entered Rome on January 17th, 1378. But by March 27th of that same year, he was dead. At that point, things get a bit out of control. When the cardinals who had come along to Rome met to elect a successor, a mob gathered outside and demanded the election not just of an Italian, but of a Roman. The cardinals inside were, almost to a man, French. So they chose the next best option, Bartolomeo Prignano, the Archbishop of Bari and Vice-Chancellor of the Church. He was at least Italian, if not Roman. The new pope took the name Urban VI and was duly presented to the people. The mob dispersed, believing they had got their wish granted. It took them a little while to figure out that Urban VI was Neapolitan rather than Roman, but there was enough time for the majority of cardinals to skip town and flee back to the safety of Avignon. Once they'd arrived back home, the Avignon cardinals declared the election of Urban VI null and void, not unreasonably, because of the threats to life and limb they had experienced during the election process. And they then proceeded to elect Robert of Geneva, a perpetrator of a massacre at Cesena and lots of other godly deeds, and called him Pope Clement VII. This is the beginning of the Western Schism, the almost 40 years when 2 and sometimes 3 competing popes tore the Christian world apart. One pope would reside in Avignon under French protection, another in Rome, supported by, amongst others, the Holy Roman Emperors, including Karl IV. We will hear a lot more about the schism when we get into the next season, but suffice to say that this split did nothing to rebuild the already damaged moral authority of the papacy. Now, the Western Schism is surely one of the seminal moments in the late Middle Ages, with implications that reverberate into modernity. But as far as the role of the empire, or more precisely, the position of the emperor himself was concerned, another long-term trend is taking shape. And that is the rivalry between France and the empire / the ruling family of the empire. So let us just quickly recap where the French monarchy is in the 1370s. The 100 Years' War between France and England had begun in 1337. The first major battle at Crécy took place in 1346, a battle that Karl had actually taken part in, and where his father had died in an act of chivalric madness. King Edward III of England had won this battle and had used it to acquire the city of Calais. When the Black Death hit in 1348, hostilities ceased for a few years, but action resumed in the 1350s. But the French luck did not improve. The next encounter at Poitiers in 1356 goes horribly wrong. The king, John II, called Le Bon, the Good, was captured. In the subsequent Treaty of Bretigny, the French ceded vast amounts of territory around the west and southwest of France to the English, and committed to pay a 3 million écus ransom for the release of their king. In return, King Edward III of England renounced his claim to the French crown. King John II was called the Good, for reasons I will explain in a minute, but should in fact have been called John the Apocalyptically Useless. He returned from captivity upon payment of the first third of the ransom and the provision of new hostages, including 2 of his sons. Now, when one of these sons escaped, John II felt honor bound to return back into captivity, where he died in 1364. Many contemporaries interpreted his return to England as a praiseworthy adherence to the chivalric code, which is why they called him the Good. But in all practical terms, this act was catastrophically ill-judged. France was on its knees due to the enormous ransom payments, the loss of large swathes of territory, and the hordes of unpaid soldiers ransacking the countryside, not to mention the recurring waves of the plague. What the country needed was an effective ruler trying to put things right. With John II absent, this burden fell on his eldest son, the future King Charles V. Now, fortunately, Charles V was nothing like his father. He was a diligent and competent man who attracted exceptional military commanders to his service, like Bertrand de Guesclin. But he was fighting with one hand tied behind his back. For one, he had his father still in England, which ruled out any action against the English. He also was seriously short of cash, forcing him to call the Estates General that squeezed concessions out of him. But one of the most serious long-term problems was his father's generosity. John II had 4 sons, and he left them each vast territories carved out of the royal purse. The youngest, who had stayed with his father in captivity in England, was the most generously rewarded. Philip was made Duke of Burgundy, and that same Philip would later acquire the county of Flanders by marriage, which made him the richest peer in France, rich enough to challenge royal authority, which then led to Agincourt, Joan of Arc, and so forth and so forth. But we're still a bit before that. Now Charles V, despite all his handicaps, managed to secure his reign in France and in 1369 resumed hostilities with the English. And again, patiently, one by one, the French, led by du Guesclin, recovered every single bit of territory they had given up in the Treaty of Brittany. This process was completed in 1378, with English possessions in France reduced to Aquitaine and Calais. Now, what all this means for our Emperor Karl is that he could step into a power vacuum led by the French preoccupation with the English. He could assert imperial authority on the western border by holding his splendid diet in Metz. He could even get the future King Charles V to accept his lands in the Dauphiné and the Franche-Comté as an imperial fief, including the whole kneeling and swearing bit. In 1365 he took a few days off from his negotiations with Pope Urban V, nipped down to Arles to get himself crowned King of the Arelate, the ancient kingdom of Burgundy. Again, nobody had done that since the days of Barbarossa. And he then used the opportunity to reorganize this kingdom of Burgundy. In particular, he moved Savoy out of the Arelate and under direct control of the empire. The weakness of the French court may have also been one of the reasons why the popes felt able to attempt a return to Rome. But this weakness did not last forever. As I said, by 1378, Charles V had returned at least his territorial position back to the status quo ante. The country was still a lot poorer, with the plague and decades of war and plundering mercenaries, but overall, the French were back in the saddle. And being back in fighting force could only mean one thing. The French were looking for some new acquisitions. And there was an opportunity out there that was truly enormous. The House of Anjou, the cadet branch of the French royal house, had amassed a whole host of crowns. Sicily, Hungary, Poland and Provence, to name a few. And they had the decency to die out, at least in part. King Louis the Great of Hungary and Poland was blessed with 3 daughters, but no son. King Charles V moved quickly and managed to get his younger son Louis engaged to King Louis's eldest daughter and heir presumptive, Catherine. The calculation behind this was obvious. Once cousin Louis of Hungary had snuffed it, the battle-hardened French army would go to Hungary, with pit stops in Provence and Sicily, and once there, Poland would be the next one on the list. Now our friend Karl IV, though now rapidly approaching his 60s, suffering abysmally from gout and the consequences of the mystery illness he had contracted in the 1350s, realized the deadly danger this plan posed for him and the empire. If the French were to rule the 2 kingdoms in his back, Hungary and Poland, the empire would be surrounded and would, in the long run, fall to the Valois as well. And there was then no room for the great House of Luxembourg and the 7 electors in this scenario. Therefore, this French plan needed to be scuppered, and scuppered at all cost. So, in 1378, he took his son and heir Wenceslas and set off to the city where he had spent his youth, Paris. No crowned emperor had been to Paris since Otto II's ill-fated attempt at taking the city in 978. And such a visit caused no end of complexity for the court officials in charge of protocol. According to Roman law, which by now was accepted as the basis of temporal justice across France, the emperor was the unconstrained ruler of the known world. Karl was emperor, and France was part of the world, so Karl was, at least in theory, the absolute monarch in France. But at the same time, this could obviously not be. All these last few centuries, French lawyers had worked on the basis that the King of France was just sort of standing in for the emperor with all the rights that come with it. And that worked perfectly fine as long as there was a 0% chance of the actual emperor ever showing up. Now, Karl was here, but he was far too politically savvy to insist on a legal fiction that could never be implemented. But what he did insist on was that the emperor formally ranked above the King of France. All the sequences of greeting and serving food and so forth were important to him because most of his power rested on the imperial prestige. At the same time, Charles V could not see himself subordinate to the emperor and insisted on being treated equally. Now, Charles V and his courtiers did an exceptional job of treading the fine line between recognizing the imperial authority whilst not really admitting that the King of France was subordinate. The event is recorded in a whole host of illuminated manuscripts, and it's quite interesting to see how much care the painters took to depict the relative rank of the monarchs. There was one ceremony, however, that the French were unwilling to allow to let take place in French soil, and that was the reading of the Christmas story in church. Because Karl had the habit to read the crucial verses, and it came to pass in those days that there went out a decree from the Emperor Caesar Augustus that all the world should be taxed. And he did that whilst wearing his full imperial regalia, crown, scepter and orb. So he basically appeared as the Emperor Caesar Augustus himself in a church. Now, to stop that from happening in France, the French held Karl back in Cambrai, which was on imperial territory, until after Christmas 1377. Now, once all these issues of protocol were sorted out, the two monarchs finally sat down to hash out their differences. No record of these discussions exists. All we know is what happened next. Part 1. The Emperor appointed the Dauphin of France, the future Charles VI, as imperial vicar, first in the Dauphiné and then in the whole of the Arelate. With that, the French monarch became the de facto ruler of Provence and the Rhone Valley, territories that had once been part of the Kingdom of Lothar, and hence lands the French kings had always and forever believed were theirs. Though the Dauphin was only made imperial vicar for life, this appointment is usually seen as the moment when Provence leaves the purview of the Holy Roman Empire. It would still take until 1486 before Provence really became formally a part of France. But for all practical purposes, that had now happened. Meanwhile, the marriage between Louis of Valois and Catherine of Hungary did not take place. Now, that was in part due to the fact that Catherine died aged 7 in 1378. But that was not the only reason. King Louis of Hungary still had another daughter, Hedwig, who he could have betrothed to young Louis. But that did not happen. Instead, Hedwig remained unmarried at her father's death, went to Poland, changed her name to Jadwiga, and married the Grand Duke of Lithuania, thereby creating the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. Now, I'm not one to speculate about what happened here, but my best guess is that Karl and Charles had come to an agreement. The French king gave up his plans on Hungary, and in exchange he got Provence. As the Germans say, better the sparrow in your hand than the dove on the roof. If that was so, then we can also see here a clear reorientation of imperial policy. Giving up positions in the west in the interest of expanding and deepening holding in the east would be a key feature of Luxembourg and the later Habsburg policy. It was also the beginning of that rivalry between the kings of France and the Holy Roman Emperors, a rivalry that would be an axis of European politics for 400 years, basically until Frederick the Great and the English mixed things up. As you hopefully see, this period of the 14th century is one of enormous change that lay the foundations for the events that will dominate the subsequent centuries. One last item we still have to tick off the list, and that is the whole subject of succession. And that is what we will do next week. I hope you will join us again. And before I go, let me just remind you that you can support the podcast by going to historyofthegermans.com/support, where you can make a one-time donation, or you can find a link to patreon.com/historyofthegermans. And again, if you have an iPhone, do not sign up on Patreon on that iPhone.